Hi, I'm Jim Linnell. In 1966, I got my very first taste of leatherwork. I loved it. I fell in love with it. I've been doing leatherwork now for well over 50 years, and I've enjoyed it tremendously. And today when people ask me, well, how do I get started in leatherwork? I usually refer them to some of the beginner's kits that are available out there. This is one like this right here. In fact, this is real similar to what I started out with. The one I had just had the basic tools in it, and then I had to find some projects, but this one even comes with some projects in it. And what I'd like to do today is just show you how these projects and these tools in this kit will get you on your way to enjoying a lifetime of leatherwork as it did for me. Well, the first thing we need to do when we get ready to do some leather work is we need to first understand the tools that we have. In the particular kit that I opened up, we've got really all of the basics that you need to get started in leatherwork, and I'd like to introduce you to those tools and show you what they'll do. But before we even get to that, we need to talk about the leather for a second. The leather that we use when we are stamping designs on the leather is mostly cowhide, and it went through a very special tanning process. It's called veg tan leather, and that process, basically what it does, it turns it into a leather that will have the pores of the leather open so that moisture will penetrate it. And this is the very first thing we have to do to get our leather ready to put a design on it, is we have to do what's called casing. And when I case a piece of leather, what I do is I usually put a fair amount of moisture on it initially. I make sure that that moisture is penetrating at least halfway through that piece of leather. We want the moisture to be down in the middle fibers of this piece of leather. When they tan a piece of leather, they put some fat liquors and oils into there, and that's what gives us some of the rich color that comes out of the leather when we're carving it. But it's the moisture that releases that. So we dampen it down pretty good like that, and then we let it start to dry out for a minute, start to come back to its original color, and then we are ready to begin stamping some designs on there. The tools that we have in our kit, while we're waiting for that to dry, the tools we have in a beginner set are really broken down into 6 basic steps. The tools that kind of are the essence of all leather carving is one called a camouflage tool, and I'll show you what these look like on leather in a minute. But the camouflage tool is one, the pear shader is another, the beveling tool is what we use to give it 3 dimension. We have a veiner tool, and this particular kit has a couple of varieties of that, but a veiner tool is used to put veins and leaves and so forth. Then we have a seeder tool, and again, its name tells you what it does. It puts seeds into the flowers and such. And then we have a background tool for putting a background texture in between all of those different gaps and such. And there's also in this particular kit one called a mule's foot that we use for additional decoration. But let me tell you, these are the most important tools that you could ever learn about in leatherworking. I can take these tools right here and I can carve a saddle. I can do projects of any size. You are not limited by how much leather work you can do by how many tools you have. What limits you is your knowledge of how to use them. And so that's what I'm going to show you, is how we use these tools to create different designs. So let me get these out of the way and get my coaster back up here again, and you can see it's starting to come back to its original color. It's not back all the way to that original color, but it's lightened up some, and this is usually about the right place where we want to have start doing our stamping and such. And just for fun, let's put a border around this, and you know what helps a lot is to have some kind of a line to follow instead of just guessing at it. And one of the things I learned how to do a long time ago, because I didn't have all these fancy tools, is I just take my edge of my thumbnail here and I just trace along, and I'm putting a really light line that's an even distance away from that border, and that'll work for what I'm about to do. And even if that line shows up a little bit now, when I stamp the tools on it, it's going to make that line disappear. So with that in place, let's take that first tool I mentioned to you, the camouflage tool, and we'll just put some impressions on it. Now, before I begin, one other thing I'd like to point out, I'm working on a piece of granite here. It's good to have a solid surface underneath your leather when you're working on it. A piece of granite like this does a great job. You can get these in a lot of different places. I know you can buy them from like Tandy Leather as well, but having a good solid surface is really important, and it has a lot to do with how your tools are going to perform. So when we do our stamping, we'll use this mallet that comes with it, and we'll stamp the impressions by holding them down with a little bit of pressure. I don't want them to skip or bounce in between each whack of the mallet. So I'm going to just make a row of impressions on that line, and you can see how quickly we could make a design around a coaster just with a row of these impressions here. Something else you'll notice, you see how that leather's starting to turn dark? In the impressions, we're getting what is called burnish. And that burnish is something that you want to try to accomplish in your carving. You want to have that leather giving you that rich color. It's a beautiful natural color that's in the leather. And what causes that burnish to show up like that is not something that's rubbing off of the tool. It is the color of the leather. It's when we compress the fibers of the leather by stamping these impressions into the leather, we end up creating, causing those fat liquors and oils to be brought to the surface. And so we get that really nice, rich color that's in there. So that's one of the signs that tells us we've got just the right amount of moisture in this piece of leather. So there you go. You can see real quickly how the camouflage tool would make a neat design. You could run that around the edge of a belt or bookmark or something like that and make a really neat design. Some of these other tools will do the same sort of thing too. This one here's that Vayner tool, or one of those Vayner tools, and it's a bit longer tool, and it makes a similar kind of an impression, but this has kind of got like some teeth along the bottom edge of it. And so we can use that one. There's another one, let's use them both here. There's another one that's a smooth version of that. Again, it's a long shell-shaped tool, and if we wanted to, we can make a design around the edge of a belt or something like that with just alternating these two tools back and forth and make some pretty neat designs. It's just a matter of lining them up. One of the things I hope you're noticing as I stamp this is that I'm holding these tools with a bit of downward pressure, and I'm also holding them down here toward the end that's doing all the work. I don't hold my tools up here at the top because this is the end that's doing all the work. I want to make sure I have good control over that end. So when you're holding these tools, hold them down near the working end of the tool, the part that's making the impression. I want to make sure that those impressions are exactly where I want them to be. So you can use these tools again in all sorts of combinations to create some really neat designs. And this is where the imagination comes in. You really are not limited with what you can do with these tools. The only thing that you are limited by is your imagination. So once I get around here with these, we can take and make these designs even more complex. We can take, for example, let's add the camouflage tool to what we just did here. A camouflage tool, just by placing it now in between these impressions, we can start stacking the impressions and make this an even more interesting design. So this is, again, this is where you get to use some creativity. When you're first starting out and getting your feet wet with leather, the things that you have to try to remember or that you need to learn are, first of all, how wet does your leather have to be? Sometimes when you read the instruction books, it says you got to wet your leather, and I've seen people actually go run it in under a faucet, you know, till it was like wringing wet all the way through. As you can see, it's still dry on the other side, but it is giving you this wonderful, rich color, and it's kind of coming back now to its original shade. So this is just right at the moment to give me some really good results. So when you're first starting out, when you first open up the kit, I'd recommend that you just play with these tools. Find out what they do. See what the impressions are. See what kind of designs you can make on a coaster or something like that. Let's see if we can make a flower here, okay? Maybe a couple of different ones. let's use the seeder tool, and that's what it does. It puts seeds in the center, so let's put a seed there, and then we'll use one of those other basic tools. It's called a pear shader, and it actually does the same thing. You can tell by the shape of it that it gets its name, pear shader, because of that. And it also shades in the leather. And I'll show you more about how that's done when we get into the leather carving part. But you can take this here tool and just working around a seed impression, you can make some pretty neat flowers real quick with just a couple of tools. So there you go, flower made with just the pear shader and a seeder tool. I wonder what other tools we could use to make flowers with. Let's see. Let me get my seed tool here again. How about let's use the background tool. Let's see what we can do with that. We took the background tool. We could do kind of the same thing. We'll use it as and make kind of like just petals with it. We'll go around this flower or this seed impression here, and we'll just make a neat little flower. This is the fun part of leatherwork, and that is that you really can be as creative as you wish to be. You can come up with some really neat designs just using your imagination. One that I did once, somebody challenged me to do a flower with that camouflage tool. Now that doesn't really look like a flower petal or anything like that, so how would we do that? Well, if we take, again, that seed for a flower center, and we just worked around the outside of it here with a set of impressions that all kind of turn the same direction. We can kind of start like that, and then if we use the same tool, just opposite that again, we can start to make actually kind of a three-dimensional petal here. Now we'll connect the dots up here at the top. And so just like that, we made a flower with the camouflage tool. So when starting out, this is what I'd recommend you do. Usually you'll have some coasters or some remnants or a bookmark or something like that in your kit that you can work with. But first of all, figure out what the tools do. Figure out how hard you got to hit them. Figure out how wet your leather's got to be. See what kind of impressions they make. You got to get comfortable with the tools. Learn how to hold them. Learn how hard to hit them and so forth. Play with the tools a little bit so that you can get some ideas of what you can do. You can make a set of coasters in nothing flat with some really neat designs that are all yours. So that's where I would have you start. And in a minute here, I'm going to show you how we use those tools to create the Western floral carving that is kind of what most people associate with leatherworking. So stay tuned. One of the other tools that come with a beginner's set of tools is called the swivel knife. And there are many who will say that this is the most difficult of all the tools to use, but again, I think if you get shown a few basics here, I think you'll find it's actually pretty easy to use. The swivel knife gets its name from the fact that this part up here does swivel. It has a blade down at the bottom. This is what does all of the work, and I'll show you how that's done in a second. But once again, we need to case our leather. So I've got another coaster here, and let's see what we can come up with for a design using just the swivel knife on this. And I'll show you a few ways to practice with this as well. But remember what I said about casing the leather. We're going to dampen it down pretty good initially here so that moisture gets at least halfway through that piece of leather. And then we're going to let that start to dry back a little bit, start to come back to its original color. So while it's doing that, here's another important thing about using the swivel knife. I have just another practice piece here, and which will work pretty good. But in this kit, there was also a piece of what looks like sidewalk chalk. And what this actually is jeweler's rouge. This is the same kind of stuff that a jeweler would put on a buffing wheel to produce a high shine on jewelry and things like that. And that's actually what it does for the swivel knife blade. And I'll explain that to you. But first we have to create a strop. My daddy had a razor strop, and sometimes he used it to sharpen his razor. Sometimes he used it on me, but no, not really. I was a pretty good kid. But this basically is what I'm making here is a razor strop, a strop for putting a polish on that blade so that blade works as smooth as possible. When you get a swivel knife, you buy a brand new one or whatever, they're pretty sharp already. They have a great angle on them. This blade here is beveled at just the right bevel, and it actually would have a good cutting edge on it, but it's not yet polished enough. And so what we do is we then strop it. We want to have this really polished up because this is what makes this knife work smoothly. And so when you're stropping the knife, I'm placing the bevel that this blade was beveled at. I'm placing that flat on the leather, and I'm just pulling it back. And I'm doing this. I'll do this 4 or 5 times on each side so that I get an even amount. And let me show you one more thing that you don't want to do. This is a bad habit that's easy to get into. I've seen folks that will strop their knife and they'll do it like this. They'll round up their knife like that when they get down here. And you know what you're doing when you do that? You're actually rounding off that edge. When you're stropping this knife, you want to pull it straight back and pick it straight up. And make sure you keep that bevel flat on that piece of leather. And you see how that leather's turning dark? You know what that is? That's actually metal coming off of this blade. I am actually removing very fine bits of metal, and that's what's happening. We're getting it all polished up. So that's one of the keys in keeping this knife operating as smoothly as possible. And I would, a habit I would encourage you to try to develop is every time you pick up this tool, you should strop it. That should be like the thing you do every time you pick it up and get ready to do some cutting. So. Keep that close by. The next thing is, how do you hold this thing? This isn't a knife like you probably have ever seen before. It doesn't have a handle or anything like that. So when I see folks trying to use this first time, I tell them, just lay it on your bench, lay it on your granite or whatever you're working on, and reach down and pick it up. And that right there is very close to the grip that you're going to use when you use this swivel knife. I place the forefinger into the yoke up to about the first knuckle. I have my thumb resting on one side of the barrel, my middle finger just opposite that. I have my ring finger resting against the side of the blade, and then as I'm making the cuts, I actually let this whole side of my hand rest on the table so that I have good balance. You don't want to try to use this tool by hanging onto it way up here. You want to hang onto it down here close to the end that's working on it. And then when we make the cuts by angling the knife away from you so that just the corner of the blade is in the leather. We do all of the pushing down with this finger here that's in the yoke, but we use all of these other fingers for steering it. So when we make a cut with this, what we do is we have it angled away like this. We're pushing down here, and then we pull it toward us, and when we do, it leaves a cut in the leather. And that's the basics of how this knife works. Now, it's called a swivel knife because, again, this part up here rotates. So when we have those nice sweeping curves and ornate scrolls and things like that, we accomplish those by rotating the knife as we pull it toward us. So when we do that, we let that swivel do the rotating. You don't see me moving my whole arm around here or anything like that. You don't see me trying to turn the leather underneath my knife as I'm working with it. I'm just rotating the knife as I pull it toward me so that it goes where I want it to go. So that's the basics of how this tool gets used. When you're practicing with the swivel knife, there's a couple of cuts that I would encourage you to learn how to do. One is a straight cut like I did. Another is a cut that curves from the right to the left, like these that I've already done, and then do some that curve from the left to the right, because sometimes you'll have to make them go that way. So learn how to do that. And then we do some S-shaped cuts. Learn how to start one direction and make like half of a figure eight. So learn how to do that with those cuts going both directions. And then one final kind of a cut that is a good practice, and that is to make a circle with this. Now, I'm going to make a circle with only making 2 cuts in the leather, and I'll do half of that circle by rotating it one direction and half of that circle by rotating the other. Okay? And if you can do these cuts right here, if you can control your swivel knife to do that, you can cut any design in any project that you ever wish to do. And why are these basic cuts so important? Let me give you an idea. One of the basic leaves that we do a lot in floral carving, in fact, I'm going to do a design here in a minute with this type of a leaf. It's called an acanthus leaf. It's just a classic part of floral design, and it's made by making a couple of these curving cuts like so. You'll make sometimes an S-shaped cut toward the top of that leaf, and another curving cut that maybe runs this other direction. And then if we put a leaf over on the other side, that would be another curving cut. And put the top end of that leaf on, and then usually these will have kind of a vein running up the center of them. But this is an acanthus leaf. This is something that you will see in a lot of floral carving, and I just did that with these basic cuts that I want you to practice. This right here, doing those cuts, will let you carve flowers. It'll carve any kind of a design into the leather. They're all done with those same basic cuts. I want to show you one more bad habit that I don't want you to pick up. If you were looking at me straight on right now, you'd see that when I'm cutting, my hand is kind of in the way. I can't actually see where this knife is in the leather because my grip does that. So I have to learn how to look in from the side so that I can see exactly where that knife is, make sure that it's following the line that I want it to follow. But what some folks will do, they'll get in the habit of leaning the knife out of the way. If you just lay it over like that, now you can see what you're doing. But when you cut under the surface of the leather, and you kind of raise up this ridge on one side of this piece of leather, and that's called undercutting. And undercutting will distort your design. It'll make it difficult for the beveling and some of the other steps that we have to do when we're cutting or when we're stamping the design into the leather. So make sure that you hold this knife perpendicular to the leather. You do have to angle it away from you, but you can't allow the flat of the blade to lean one side or the other. So when you're coming around a corner, when you're doing like one of these curving cuts like this, you'll notice that the top of that knife is actually rocking back and forth. You see how the top of my knife is going like this? The reason it's doing that is because I'm trying to keep it perpendicular to the leather so that as I come around those corners, I don't undercut. I want to make sure that I stay nice and 90 degree to the leather there. So this is the other tool that is an important tool in doing the floral carving, and this is one that needs some practice. In fact, that's true with all of the tools in here. What makes them work really isn't the tool, it's how much practice you're willing to put into it. So I'd encourage you to get some extra rounders, get some scrap leather, whatever, and work with these tools, practice with these tools, learn how to make them do what they're designed to do. But this one right here is one that you will start out putting your design into leather with when we do the floral carving. It's called the swivel knife.